Good evening. I am Doug Ward. I'm the chair of the board of Farm Radio International. And I, with the others, would like to thank the Walrus Foundation, MasterCard, and the University of British Columbia for the great opportunity we have tonight to explore this important and exciting topic. I see that I'm the only northern guy in the panel tonight. I think, though, that if we'd been in a similar panel 20 years ago, there probably would have been 6 guys like me sucking on their pipes talking about the future of Africa and African leadership, and if lucky, would be one person from Africa here. So I think there has been some progress, at least in the designing of events on this topic. And while I might be a northerner and an outsider, most of the comments I'll make tonight have come from what I've learned from our staff at Farm Radio International in Africa and from the Africans that we work with. I want to talk about Africa's next rural generation and its leaders. There are about 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. And last year, I remember reading that for the first time, at least half of those people are in towns and cities, and half of them are in villages and on farms. And that's the first time it's moved slightly over to being a majority of people in towns and cities. Now, whether that factoid is true or not, it is a trend we know is coming. And as we have found on every other continent on the planet, you can't keep people down on the farm if they don't want to stay there. In fact, if I was a young woman in rural Africa, the first thing I'd probably want to do is to move to a city where there was more chance of being physically secure and getting access to schooling and to decent health, or at least some kind of health care. However, for reasons that are both economic and traditional, it is highly likely that most of the young Africans who live rurally will stay over the next couple of transitional generations with one foot in the country and one foot in the town or the city. They do not want to give up the roots and security of the rural land. And at the same time, they are hugely attracted by the towns and the cities where they can patch together an income from diverse sources and get the cash, the internet, and the other trappings of modern life. And those who stay on the land will not be satisfied with the rhythm of life and work of their parents, and certainly not of their grandparents. They will not be satisfied, for example, to plant a crop, or maybe 2 crops, and then wait around for months for a harvest. Instead, the next rural generation will want to, just like their city compatriots, to cobble together a diverse set of economic activities that will give them a regular cash flow to satisfy their lifestyle. And that intended lifestyle includes things like substantial homes. What a surprise. Electrical appliances, the internet, access to motorized farming equipment, and possibly even a family motorbike. Now, the economic activities that are going to be required in order to feed that lifestyle will include things like this: growing high-value crops in greenhouses or other controlled environments, crops that can be sold throughout the year and don't require much land. Another is the processing of raw agricultural products from the countryside, cassava, honey, into the manufacturing goods, and doing that processing in the rural areas so that there is both food for the rural areas and food for sale in the markets for the cities and towns. And the techies among these rural people will be adapting mobile phones, the world's favorite toy and tool for rural purposes, including apps for agricultural extension, for market development, for providing credit, and I think also for things like enhancing collective security in rural areas. And in order to ensure that these people get the return that they deserve, the next rural African generation will find ways to aggregate their numbers to have some clout, some negotiating power in the marketplace. This will not be through the old, dreaded co-ops of an earlier age, that early post-colonial age, co-ops that were often manipulated by their governments. This will be through new cooperative ventures that rural Africans will be able to keep under their control. Now, I titled my comments about it being an optimistic view, and it is somewhat optimistic because there are two sides, the best of times and the worst of times. All of the above depends on there being an enabling environment, something you've also heard tonight, for these things to happen in. And that enabling environment for rural prosperity requires a few things. First, security of person, security of land. People will move to towns permanently if the rural areas are not safe. Why would they plant crops if someone else is going to grab the harvest or grab the land? Another is improvements to rural education. New rural economic activity and new rural institutions needed for that economic activity will require decent primary and some secondary education. And that education has to be tailored towards running the actual small businesses and institutions that can flourish in rural areas. Of course, primary health care is going to be so crucial to keeping people down on the farm. And then after primary care, there has to be the more elaborate forms of care needed in towns nearby that can be accessed over decent roads. These are basics for an optimistic future in rural Africa. Another thing I think that's needed is access to supportive media. This next generation of rural African producers need a steady flow of good information as they revamp their rural economy and livelihoods. They also need media that will amplify their voices in the discourse of development. And given the amount of change that they will initiate, they need media that will support them as they take up new practices that they themselves have decided to pursue. And if you haven't already guessed it, this is the kind of work that Farm Radio International is involved in. The enabling environment needs these grassroots producer and supplier co-ops that I've mentioned before to ensure that the producers get the compensation that they deserve for their work. I've been told, however, that many African politicians do not like these new style co-ops. Why? Because they are not as easily controlled or manipulated by those same politicians. And finally, in that enabling environment, they need an enabling environment. That fundamental aspect of life. And if they don't have that enabling environment, if they have an environment that devastates through extreme weather events and that makes rural prosperity impossible, nothing is possible. But of course, getting that enabling environment is not something that is in the hands of the next generation of African rural people and their governments. For that, we need a whole lot more Walrus talks where we can invite a whole lot of these white guys who run the first world and hold them to account. Thank you very much.